The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. 3 years ago, Barack Obama began his presidency by reaching out to the Muslim world. During his Cairo speech in 2009, he called for a new beginning to the relationship between America and the world of Islam, a relationship that he said would now be based on mutual respect. Last week, as you probably saw play out on your television or your computer screen, that Muslim outreach doctrine burst into flames here in the Middle East. And the fuse that set off the inferno, ironically, was lit in Cairo. Last Tuesday, the 11th anniversary of 9/11, a mob of about 2,000 Islamists, led by Mohammed Zawahiri, he's the brother of Al-Qaeda's leader, they stormed the walls of the U.S. compound in Cairo, burned the American flag, and then hoisted up a black flag bearing the words, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." Now later that same day, as you know, in Benghazi, Libya, about 400 terrorists carrying guns and rocket-propelled grenades, they burned down the U.S. consulate, they murdered the American ambassador and also a consulate officer and 2 U.S. Marines. Now neither of these two countries, Egypt or Libya, had ever hosted such an attack against America before last week. But this is now the new reality in North Africa, in the Middle East. A few days after last week's events on 9/11, in Tunisia, there were Islamist protesters. They scaled the wall of the U.S. Embassy compound, broke windows, started fires. Some of them burned down a U.S. school. In those protests, there were 2 protesters that were killed, 29 others that were wounded. And they too raised up the black flag of Al-Qaeda over the embassy. In Sudan, there was gunfire heard near the U.S. embassy. And then it was the German embassy, really, that was hit the hardest. In that incident, Sudanese policemen just stepped right aside as 5,000 protesters surrounded the German embassy. Then there's Lebanon. In Lebanon, 1 person was killed, 2 were wounded. A restaurant was burned down. And this particular attack coincided with Pope Benedict's visit to the region. Then there's Yemen. The United States had to dispatch more Marines to ward off attacks against its embassy there. And of course, right here in Jerusalem as well. Jerusalem didn't escape. There weren't violent protests or clashes, but there was a small demonstration, even here, just on the other side of the old city behind me, at the Damascus Gate. And you can imagine that this too will lead to something even bigger down the road. But even outside of the Middle East, there were clashes in London and Sydney, Australia of all places. In London, you might have seen pictures, 200 protesters there. They burned an American flag. They burned an Israeli flag just outside the U.S. Embassy. And in Sydney, there were Muslim protesters there, waving signs that read, "Behead all those who insult the Prophet." Imagine seeing a sign like that in downtown Sydney as you're maybe walking with your family and seeing these signs at a protest, quote unquote, calling for the beheading of people who would insult Muhammad. This whole scene, as Joel Hilliker wrote at thetrumpet.com just last week, it bears an uncanny resemblance to the events of 1979. That's when the United States, of course, helped to drive out the Iranian Shah, an American ally. They drove him out, though, in favor of this popular rebellion. And soon after that, of course, Ayatollah Khomeini came in and the Islamists stormed America's embassy in Tehran and took all of its staff hostage. And it all happened so incredibly fast. Now today, the United States is only a few months removed from having pushed all of these autocrats from office, and already we see America losing diplomats, losing Marines to the very radicals that we helped to legitimize. Let me read to you what my father wrote soon after President Obama's Cairo speech of 3 years ago. This was published at thetrumpet.com on June 22, 2009. He said, "We are witnessing a reenactment of the 1930s between Chamberlain and Hitler." He said Chamberlain tried to negotiate his way to peace as Hitler gobbled up Europe. My father says, President Obama thinks that through his words he will have peace with Iran. But after the terrorists heard that speech now from June of 2009, he says, after the terrorists heard that speech, they had to be rejoicing. When America's president gives a speech like that, the terrorists have contempt for such weakness and are stirred to fight even harder. They can smell the victory. So we can expect, he said, we can expect violent terrorism to intensify and shake the nations. And then he concluded by saying, we won't have long to wait to see who is right. So we can't very well say that we were surprised by what happened last week here in the Middle East and in North Africa, but still, it's stunning to see just how fast these prophetic events are moving. Now I want to refer you to a recent Key of David program that my father recorded. He taped this particular show back toward the end of August, and it was scheduled to be played on television stations all over the world just last weekend on September the 9th. Here's a clip from that particular program.
Something really, really dramatic happened in the last 2 and 3 weeks in the Middle East. Something very alarming that is far-reaching and also very prophetic. Now, if you check with the leaders of the U.S. and even the Western world, I think most of them would be unaware of what is happening in the Middle East in this particular case. And if not, if they're aware of it, they're probably silent and saying very little about it. And yet, this event is going to change the course of history in the Middle East. Until recently, Egypt has been at peace with Jerusalem for like 30 years, and in the last 20 of those 30 years, we have been prophesying that Egypt and Iran were going to become allies, and that peace with Jerusalem and with the U.S. was going to change into becoming violent enemies against us. In the month of August 2012, the Daniel prophecy that we've been talking about for nearly 20 years was fully and totally fulfilled. It is now reality. Egypt and Iran are allied. Egypt is allied with the number one state sponsor of terrorism in the world. What does that mean for the Middle East and for the entire world? This is the new reality. Whether we like it or not, this is the way it is, and that prophecy in Daniel 11 has now, at this very time, been fully fulfilled. But that's not all. There is another problem that is going to make it much worse. Egypt is only a part of a huge, devastating prophecy that is unfolding in the Middle East. And now I'm going to show you that I am understanding something that only began in my mind the last week or two. And that is that Iran and Egypt are going to have a great deal to do with sweeping Libya and Ethiopia along into that radical Islamic camp. And that too is prophesied right there in Daniel 11, though we have not seen it as clearly as we do now. So we do see it, and God is showing us exactly what is happening in the Middle East and in this world. But few people are willing to listen to God. Few people are willing to understand His prophecies. But we should be paying attention, because there are going to be some serious consequences of our policy toward the Middle East. That Bible prophecy being fulfilled is going to certainly cause gas prices to skyrocket, maybe double, triple or even quadruple. Who knows how high they might go. But we're really bringing all of these things upon ourselves because of our policy toward the Middle East. It is happening because of what we are doing in the Middle East as far as our foreign policy is concerned.
So on September 9th, he said we needed to pay attention because there would be serious consequences for America's Middle East policy. That's what he said just 2 days before the 11th anniversary of 9/11. Now the question for you, as he asked on that particular program, is are you paying attention? And will you listen to God? A few years ago, just a few years ago, leading up to the presidential campaign of 2008, Mr. Obama was promising that Muslim hostility would ease the day he was inaugurated, should he be elected as president. That was just a few years ago. And here we are today, reading headlines like the one in the New York Times yesterday, which said the United States is preparing for a long siege of Arab unrest. A long siege! You see how it's all happening so incredibly fast? And yet, as my father brought out in that remarkable program, God is showing us exactly what will happen in this particular region and in all over the world. He's showing us through the pages of his Bible, through Bible prophecy. After distributing that program a few weeks ago, by the way, there was one station that was scheduled to play it that refused to put it to air. And do you know the reason why they rejected that program? Well, here's another clip from the program. You can see for yourself.
Now, Iran and Egypt, even now, Egypt also, along with Iran, says that the United States and Israel are the two enemies they have to be concerned about. And yet we've been giving aid, over $1 billion of aid, I think about $1.5 billion every year to Egypt, mainly to their military. And did you know we continue to give that aid? In spite of what's happening in Egypt, we're helping them to do their dirty work, and we have to borrow money from China to even give them that aid. That's an amazing development.
They had a problem, this station had a problem with the facts and figures cited in that quote you just saw. Evidently, they said, we didn't provide enough proof, enough substantial proof to support what we said about the United States giving all of this financial aid to Egypt. And it's really amazing. 2 days after that, we see this region explode in violence. And it seems like every single commentator that had anything of substance to say about the turmoil here in the Middle East was talking about that $1.5 billion in aid that America gives to Egypt as the Egyptian leaders turn a blind eye to all of this violence swirling about the U.S. Embassy. I mean, after the events of last week, there were members in Congress who were questioning whether or not the United States should continue giving all of this aid to Egypt. It's just common knowledge that we're pouring money into Egypt, that we're responsible largely for building up their military. Now let me just play you one more clip. This is from a speech that Representative Michelle Bachmann gave just last Friday on September the 14th. She gave this speech at a Values Voter Summit in Washington, D.C. Take a look.
In light of the attacks this week on our embassy in Cairo, we need to tell the Muslim Brotherhood-controlled government in Egypt, if you continue to inflame sentiments against the United States, we will immediately put an end to the United States taxpayer gravy train that we're sending your way. Starting with the $1.5 billion we send Egypt in aid and the $1 billion in loan forgiveness program and the $5 billion International Monetary Fund loan program that we're backing. We also need to stop the upcoming state visit that President Obama agreed to welcome Egyptian President Morsi into the White House, and we need to cancel the planned joint military exercises that we have just recently planned with the Egyptian military.
So there are the latest facts and figures from a congresswoman who happens to be a member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and also the Financial Services Committee. Now, of course, there might have been other reasons that this particular station in the States wouldn't play that September 9th program of the Key of David, but really that's neither here nor there. Of course, there's going to be people, like my father brought out in that very program, who will resist the message just because it's God's truth. As my father said there, few people are willing to listen to God. But listen, if you will, listen. If the events of this past week won't wake us up and get our attention, then something is wrong with us. Because look at what is happening in this particular region. Let me just read to you one verse today, Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. You've heard this verse probably dozens of times on the Trumpet Daily, the Key of David. And speaking of that Key of David episode once again, if you haven't watched the entire episode, make sure that you go and do that. You can watch it online at thetrumpet.com. Just click on the Key of David tab at the Trumpet site. Now this verse in Daniel 11 and verse 40, Daniel writes, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him." So here's this Iranian king of the south, this Iranian king of terror, the king of the Middle East that you've read so much about at thetrumpet.com. Here is the real power behind all the terrorist uprisings that we're now seeing in the Middle East. It's sponsored, it's promoted, it's pushed by this king in Iran. The verse continues, "And the king of the north," this is speaking now of the resurrected Holy Roman Empire that's now rising in Europe. God says, "The king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So here is an end-time prophecy about a powerful and aggressive radical Islam led by Iran, and its foreign policy is to bully and to push its way into controlling the Middle East. And eventually it'll push hard enough to provoke a furious response from the king of the north, this great power that's now developing in Europe. Now, significantly, the United States in this particular prophecy is not even mentioned. And this is a latter-day prophecy that talks about what's to happen, that talks about a clash that's to happen before the prophesied Great Tribulation, and the U.S. is not even mentioned. Now, after the past week, you can certainly see why. Notice what Charles Krauthammer had to say. This is an interview on Fox News just last week, September the 14th. He said, "We have dominated," speaking of the United States, he said, "We have dominated the region since 1970. We are now in retreat." He says, "The president proclaimed the tide of war is over. He took us out of Iraq, leaving no residual force. He announced a withdrawal from Afghanistan on a timetable. When it came to the Arab Spring, he was indecisive. When you had the Green Revolution in Iran, he would not support the protesters. Libya, half in, half out. Everybody in the region understands that America, which had been the dominant element, is now in withdrawal, is not interested. The Gulf Arabs are apoplectic," he says, "about Iran going nuclear. It's not just Israel. And now our friends are looking around and saying, do we really have anybody who will support us?" And the extreme jihadists and the moderate jihadists in the region are saying, this is our time. That's what's happening. He's right. That is what's happening. And now, you're not just reading about it in advance at thetrumpet.com. You're seeing it play out for yourself. You're seeing it play out on your television screen. And it's all happening. It's all happening so incredibly fast. Now go back, please, and watch that Key of David episode that my father recorded just before just before these most recent explosive events. And then check in with thetrumpet.com regularly so that you can understand your world. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.